Nothing is more difficult than hunting the hunter of man.
A serial killer is a predator, but they hunt human prey.
The FBI investigates at least 50 serial killings per year.
They have fantasies that drive them to violence, and they kill and kill again.
Who becomes a victim is determined by only one thing: the mind of the serial killer.
A profile is a psychological portrait of a killer. It establishes a map into the mind of the murderer.
And that is where the hunt has to begin. Alexandria, Virginia, on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. Two police officers revisit a series of brutal murders that occurred 2 decades ago.
The first case that occurred, the body was found in a drain area.
Detective Tom Moorhead fills in the case history for his visitor.
The second one was reported missing, and it was 6 weeks before we found her. Her automobile was found right away.
The body count kept rising.
Number 3 was found in a creek, submerged in the water. There was a sexual assault on all those. There was, after the autopsy, fluids were sent to the lab, and it indicated that they had been raped.
The details of the killings were so gruesome they shocked even seasoned investigators.
There was 2 that was stabbed. The one had been missing for about 6 weeks. She had been stabbed somewhere at 20 times to the upper part of her body. The medical examiner had said it as an indication of overkill, which is a lot of times they're acting in sort of a frenzy.
5 women. 3 of them died in just 1 month.
At that particular point, we had no idea who it was. So we were just wondering how long would it be for the next one.
What makes a man kill his fellow man? There are no easy answers, but Robert Ressler has made it his mission to find them. The emerging profile of a profiler. Robert Ressler began his career as a military investigator for the U.S. Army. He was stationed in Europe and the Far East. In the Army, he learned how to catch criminals.
I became convinced that understanding the motives of the killer would ultimately make me better at catching them. So I started studying psychology and continued as a criminal investigator.
Upon leaving the Army, Robert Ressler was looking for a way to achieve his goal.
I wanted to work for the best, and that was the FBI. Here I thought I could combine my knowledge of criminal behavior and psychology. I was especially interested in serial killers because here I thought psychology played a major role in why they killed and how.
When Ressler joined the Bureau in 1970, his interest in modern psychology was frowned upon. The FBI was a place where hard evidence counted. Despite the internal opposition, Ressler formulated a plan to study the behavior of serial killers. He called it profiling.
And I had a working lunch with the director of the FBI this time, William Webster. At the end of the lunch, he looked at me and said, Mr. Ressler, I think you have a great idea. I want you to align yourself with academics and outside people outside the FBI of the highest quality, and I want this program to be successful. And that gave it life.
Back in Alexandria, Virginia, the killer had stabbed his victim first in the back, then the front, then everywhere. The morgue. This is where Robert Ressler looks for clues.
Each time I walk into a room like that, I'm afraid I'm going to see something worse than I've ever seen before. I figured out very early that there are two types of serial killers, and that's organized and disorganized. Just by looking at the crime scene and how the bodies are found, I can establish a pretty good basis for a profile.
Detective Moorhead tells Ressler that all victims were found completely dressed, yet they had all been raped before they were killed.
If they're dressed properly, I would say that the killer has ordered them to dress themselves. If they're dressed improperly, then it would indicate the killer dressed them after death. So whether or not they were dressed by themselves or whether or not they were dressed by the killer becomes, again, another look into the killer's mind.
Ressler notes this telling detail. If the killer was able to instruct the women to dress, this would suggest somebody who was in control of his own senses, enough to plan the kill. An organized mind at work. This is how it always begins, picking up the scent, beginning to track the serial killer.
On a very personal level, I just wonder, what is this force that takes a hold of a person and pushes them over the edge?
Robert Ressler has been on the trail of this evil ever since he was 9 years old. Catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself. Scrawled with lipstick on the wall by a desperate killer. Chicago, 1946. A city gripped by fear. The chilling words of America's first modern serial killer captured the imagination of the entire country. 2 women, brutally murdered, found in carefully arranged settings. The killer had even bandaged the mortal wounds, as if ashamed of what he had done.
It came into my head that I must have done something, and I realized it must have been a child.
The northwest side of Chicago. This is where Robert Ressler grew up.
So it's good to be back in Chicago.
Well, you know, it's been...
He still stays in touch with his old friend Philip Kozlovsky. Together, they roamed the neighborhood streets when they were boys. It was a long, hot summer when the string of bizarre killings known as the Lipstick Murders shook the city. The boys were so intrigued, they formed their very own detective agency. Their mission? To catch the lipstick murderer.
The whole idea came from some movie that we had seen where kids were detectives, and we decided we were going to do this.
Could have been, right. Because there was a lot of cloak and dagger involved with this, you know, the kind of the false beards and the dark glasses, which, of course, no proper spy operation can be without.
But the games soon ended when the killer struck again. Police found body parts floating in the Chicago sewers. They identified the victim as 6-year-old Susan Degnan. She had been snatched from her home, murdered and dismembered.
It really paralyzed the city of Chicago. It was a frightening aspect to have a child taken from her bedroom in the dead of night. Body parts found in sewers. And of course, this guy confessing to all.
The police arrest William Herons, a 17-year-old student. He confesses everything. The lipstick murderer now has a face.
The Herons case had a tremendous impact in general on people in Chicago. And in your case, it actually led you to try to somehow gain some insight into the mind of this person as to why he was doing it. And then this led you into the career that you eventually decided upon.
That's the way I see it. The lipstick murders just caught my imagination, and that never went away. I wanted to understand people like William Hearns.
Hearns broke into the apartments of young women. When he was caught, he would kill, almost like an afterthought. Killing was not the satisfaction. It was a necessary evil.
The fact is he had this real obsessive-compulsive drive to do these burglaries, and it became so strong that he could no longer fight those urges. The question was, do these killers suffer from an irresistible compulsion, or is it a compulsion that they choose not to resist?
The young boy Ressler was hooked.
I made up my mind. I wanted to become a real live detective. Remember that guy that used to deliver groceries to my house?
The man who delivered groceries to the Ressler home was none other than one of the most horrific serial killers of our time. John Wayne Gacy, the killer in the clown mask.
Clowns get away with murder.
1978. John Wayne Gacy was a respected citizen of Chicago. On weekends, he often entertained children in a homemade clown costume. Nobody knew what the mask was really hiding.
Gacy and I grew up in the same neighborhood. We were in the Boy Scouts together. I sometimes wonder how we ended up on the opposite sides of the law. What made me a cop? What made him a serial killer?
Joe Kosensak was the man who hunted down John Wayne Gacy. Following weeks of surveillance, the chief of detectives ordered Gacy's house searched. After a young man disappeared who had spoken with Gacy about a job at his construction company, Kosensak obtained a warrant to search Gacy's house.
The crawl space was actually found by a detective who spotted a cut in the tile. And he called me over. We got a screwdriver and we pried up on the trapdoor. We didn't know it was a trapdoor at the time, but the whole bottom floor of this closet lifted up, and then we saw that this was an entry area into a crawl space. And when we opened the trapdoor, an evidence technician dropped down into the crawl space area, and within 5 minutes called up and said that we have 3 bodies down here. And it just sent a chill up all of our backs to think that there were X unknown amounts of bodies. It's pretty overwhelming.
I heard the news on the radio. This was a huge case. There's a guy that had planned to kill 33 men and premeditated exactly what I was looking for to test my theories of organized serial killer.
Ressler flew to Chicago and offered to assist Joe Kosensak in his investigation.
I came in on the investigation after the body started to be found. I went to the FBI locally and said, what can I do to help? I come from the FBI Behavioral Science Unit where we have some insights into this material. One thing that I urged him to look for were personal items of people who had been reported missing in the area.
The police found an ID card in Gacy's file drawer. It belonged to a young man who had been missing for several months.
And it just adds to a lot of things you told us about the minds of these people.
Yeah, that's one thing we found out about them. They keep items of personal nature from the victims. The serial killer keeps the class rings, gold chains, the belt buckles, the ID cards, and all that to him is trophies or souvenirs that remind him of his successes that he's satisfied with. So it can relate right to normal behavior, but on a very bizarre level.
What was really interesting is the fact that the evidence, most of the evidence we found, was set up on Gacy's dresser in his bedroom, which, from my perspective, almost resembled an altar.
Body after body was retrieved from John Wayne Gacy's house. Most of the corpses were already decomposed. For the officers, it was a gruesome task.
What had he done to these boys? It was like being in the middle of the worst nightmare.
The violence involved in this crime was just horrendous. A lot of police officers wound up being depressed over this thing because they never saw people tortured and killed in this manner.
Later, when I was having Christmas dinner with my family, it started hitting me that 33 kids will never have another Christmas. I was there with my family. What I had seen, it was just a devastating thing.
Gacy's house was completely dismantled. Today, a new building stands on this lot. John Wayne Gacy, on his way to justice. He became instantly America's most notorious serial killer. During his trial, Gacy maintained that an alter ego had committed the crimes.
This may have been a lie, but it squared with my belief that even an organized serial killer may become dissociated from their crimes.
In his cell, Gacy waited for the verdict, but there was no surprise, only the death sentence. After Gacy's arrest, Ressler convinced his superiors at the FBI that extensive interviews with serial killers like Gacy would benefit the profiling program.
I explained that a man like Gacy can tell us so much about why they kill. It was an opportunity we could not pass up. I'm glad they agreed.
So Robert Ressler conducted the first landmark interview with John Wayne Gacy. He laid out the first detailed map of the mind of a serial killer.
The Gacy interview reinforced my beliefs about serial killers. The interview confirmed that a man who is seemingly in control of himself can also function in our society and still be a lethal predator. An organized killer is the most dangerous one.
And the rope trick?
It's in a tourniquet, so it cut off the air. So if you're going to kill somebody, you just put it on their neck and twist it 3 times or 4 times or whatever until the person stopped moving.
Then finally came the day of reckoning for John Wayne Gacy. He had asked that Robert Ressler be present at his execution, but the FBI agent refused. During the night of the execution, Ressler woke up just after midnight, precisely the time when John Wayne Gacy died. Ressler was sweating and had trouble breathing. He was looking at a painting, a gift Gacy had given him after their meeting. A self-portrait of the killer as a clown. Back in Alexandria, Virginia, the killer strangled his next victim with his bare hands. The next step. In order to begin developing a profile of the Alexandria killer, Ressler seeks inspiration from the horrors of his old case files.
You have to see the dirty, ugly, dangerous place where the mind lives. You have to spend a lot of time there. Sometimes it gets hard to close the door when I leave.
First, Ressler assembles clues that suggest a common pattern.
The women are all approximately the same age, they're approximately the same appearance. The circumstances of their disappearance is all similar. Where they were found, similar once again. So there were similarities that we can work with from the standpoint of developing a profile. Stabbing, drowning, strangulation. This guy hadn't found his passion yet. The killer in this case would most likely be a youthful male. I wouldn't be looking at a skilled older male who'd been in and out of prison a number of times, but I would say somebody between late teens, early to mid-20s. Looking at an individual who would be coming from a disrupted childhood. Looking for an individual who'd be coming from a dysfunctional home life. Absent father would almost be a given. He uses his victims as objects for his own sexual gratification. He's killed 5 times and is going to kill again. He's not going to stop unless he is stopped.
It's not always possible to catch a serial killer before he strikes again. Some of them are so elusive, they kill for years before they are hunted down. like Ted Bundy.
It was like coming out of some horrible trance or dream.
If there was one man that really scared me, it was Ted Bundy. And I really still don't know if I figured him out.
Seattle, Washington, 1974. Police investigate the disappearance of 6 female college students. 2 more were abducted in broad daylight. They were all young women with the same characteristics. All brunette, beautiful, and bludgeoned to death. Bob Keppel of the Seattle Police was in charge of the investigation and is still haunted by this case today.
He's really an enigma. Nailing down a real pattern with him would be really rough because, I mean, he had so many different approaches.
Well, we didn't know anything about his approaches, and then when we started finding his victims, of course, we couldn't tell any patterns because all we found were bones.
Bundy was an animal, and anything else he wanted to be.
Bundy is really what I call a chameleon. Now, this guy could change his color to almost any situation. He's got so many faces, you know, he could be almost anything he wanted to be. He could be on a college campus looking the part of a young assistant professor. He could be a ski bum. He could be in a suit and tie, a young attorney. It really seemed that the guy could certainly change to fit almost any situation.
One of Bundy's favorite tricks to lure his victims was to put his arm in a sling and drop some books. He would ask the young women to pick them up. Then he would hit them with a short crowbar, drag them in his car, abuse, torture, and kill them, and then hide the bodies in the woods.
Girls in bikinis, long hair, short-framed females, and that was his style of victim.
I've come to feel that he's almost a profiler in his own right from profiling victims, because it seemed in any group like that you're describing, he could pretty much pick the ones that were going to be the most vulnerable. The choice of victims tells us a lot about the killer. Bundy was an example of an organized killer. He needed girls who looked alike. Maybe a killer like Bundy is a little easier to figure out because they have a master plan. But until you know that plan, they remain as hard to pin down as any psychotic killer.
When Ressler was asked to help in the design of the wanted poster, he was able to warn young, attractive women who fit Bundy's profile. When Bundy was finally arrested in 1978, Bob Keppel and Robert Ressler were among the first law enforcement officers to interview him.
He's the type of guy that you only get into his head when he's ready for it. We try to go in, talk to him at his level or slightly below, because we were warned that if we ever got in a situation where we looked like we're talking down on him, it would close him off.
I was really afraid that he got deeper into my mind than I ever got into his. I still don't really know who was in control, and that bothers me to this day. Bundy was a master at his game.
Bundy's final ploy. He offered Ressler to become a consultant to the Behavioral Science Unit. The master killer would teach his most attentive class. But the FBI turned down this deal. January 24th, 1989. The entire world is waiting for Bundy's execution. In his cell, the killer is reading a book. He knows the end is near. Outside, a crowd has gathered to celebrate his passing.
When the guards cleared out his cell after his death, they found one of my textbooks on serial killers. Bundy taught us one thing. You needed an organized effort to analyze them and their crimes. We had a cross-reference system. We could have connected his crimes much easier. With better profiles, we could have zeroed in much quicker. After Bundy, we made sure we created a national database that made all this possible.
After Bundy, the FBI understood the value of profiling.
Without criminal profiling, the investigators have no idea what type of person they're looking for. They don't know the age, they don't know the sex, they don't know the race. They have no ideas as to the personality of the individual.
Before profiling, agents were looking for ordinary forensic evidence, blood, fibers, or fingerprints to identify a potential suspect.
When a profile is available, it gives the investigator the ability to shortcut his investigations and to go right to the most logical suspect. And oftentimes that's your killer.
Robert Ressler has written extensively about the criminal mind. His experience with the most notorious serial killers is at the heart of his approach to profiling.
It all comes down to organized and disorganized. Gacy and Bundy made plans. They knew how to satisfy the urge to kill, and they planned accordingly. Parents acted out of compulsion. No real plan. All of this taught me one thing. You can scientifically classify these monsters. The criminal profile looks for the calling card or the business card that the killer leaves at the scene. You're looking at the position of the body, the condition of the body. You're looking for any ritualization or ritualized behavior at that scene. You're looking for the wound patterns. There's a great deal of difference between one stab wound in the heart and 50 stab wounds around the chest area, or actual removal of body parts, heads, sexual organs, things of that nature. There are many things that are left at that scene that give direct clues to the personality of the killer.
Ressler has also been a television and film consultant.
We all know from the entertainment media, from movies, that we might be looked upon as some sort of answer-all. He comes on the scene, he does a profile, the case is solved. It really doesn't work that way. The profile is one tool in the toolbox of the investigator.
During his years at the FBI, Robert Ressler had mastered this tool like nobody else. The FBI Training Academy in Quantico, Virginia. Since 1976, this is where Robert Ressler, John Douglas, and other early members of the Behavioral Science Unit taught young FBI agents the art of profiling. Here, he helped teach the next generation of profilers.
We're not social workers, we're not psychologists, we're not psychiatrists. We have backgrounds in many of these areas we try to do.
Bob Ressler was one of the original thinkers in the arena of criminal investigative analysis.
Steve Band is the current head of the Behavioral Science Unit.
He was one of the original thinkers when it came to understanding that there is something different about individuals who are predators. The early view of victimology in relation to crime scene emerged on his watch. And he was one of the contributors to that concept of profiling as we know it today in the FBI.
The FBI is still indebted to Robert Ressler and his work.
The whole idea of going out to a prison and sitting down and trying to understand what made these people who were the most notorious serial killers tick, there's a tremendous amount of originality in that. Nobody had done this type of thing before.
But in essence, everybody at the FBI realizes that profiling is not entirely new.
Police officers and detectives have been doing profiling without giving it that name. And the fact that the FBI or a Bob Ressler or his associates have come in this last century or last couple decades and have organized some of the thoughts that detectives have been doing for hundreds of years, is that new knowledge? Is that magic? No.
Profiling is not the ultimate weapon against serial killers. At any given time, there are between 35 and 50 on the loose in America alone. The Alexandria case continues. The next victim was held underwater by the killer until she stopped struggling. Detective Moorhead and Robert Ressler on their way to the last crime scene.
This particular case here, the lady was found by some kids that were playing in the area around this stream, and they went in the culvert and found her body about halfway down with debris from the storm that had been washed in there and it was thrown over the body. And this is the culvert that she was found in.
This is the place where the killer struck down his last victim.
Sometimes it feels like the killer is still here. It's chilling. It's frightening. I often wonder, am I not venturing too far?
It all revolved around having complete control. Why and where it came from, I don't know.
Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 1991. This is where Jeffrey Dahmer lived and killed.
It was like stepping into maybe the abyss. Here was a small apartment where the worst horrors that man could even conceive of took place. Jeffrey Dahmer got to me personally. Joey Boyle, his defense attorney, asked me to testify on his behalf.
Mr. Boyle?
This nice, pleasant young man. How do you explain it?
Boyle wanted to prove that Dahmer was insane and killed during psychotic episodes.
I was intrigued. Was there actually an organized killer who lost control during the killing?
A young man led police to an apartment where he said Jeffrey Dahmer had tortured him and was about to kill him when he escaped.
They found, of course, skulls in the refrigerator, plus they found other remnants of human beings' bodies in a tank in his bedroom.
There were also big barrels of acid in which Dahmer was dissolving some of his victims.
He was piling up bodies in his apartment. He had body parts in the bedroom. He had body parts in the refrigerator. He had bones in file drawers. He had heads and skulls in vats of acid. Anybody that would have gotten into that apartment at that time and really looked around with some knowledge would have been horrified that they'd stepped into hell.
The private hell created by one man, suffered by his victims.
I was very grateful to have the chance to interview Jeffrey Dahmer. He seemed so normal. He was likable. There was nothing offensive about him. You almost felt a kinship with him. And at the same time, what he was saying was enough to literally curl your hair.
Okay, tell me about that. I wasn't getting the satisfaction, so I took it to a new level. So after they were drugged, I would drill a small bore hole in the skull. And with a large syringe, it's used for pasting. And I'd fill that up with muriatic acid, injected it in the frontal lobes, hoping to...
What effect did it have?
It didn't seem to have much of an effect. He woke up about 2 hours later, groggy, complaining of a headache, and so I gave him more sleeping pills and then strangled him.
And he believed by doing this he could create a person with no mind, a compliant sex object, but alive. He said that way I wouldn't have to get more victims. I could just keep the sex zombie.
Now, Ressler understood why Dahmer had to kill again and again and again. A perfect example of an organized serial killer at work.
Towards the end, Dahmer was no longer in control. He was just looking for the next victim and trying to clean up the last victim.
During Jeffrey Dahmer's trial, Robert Ressler was not allowed to testify. The judge rejected the insanity plea. Ressler is still convinced that Dahmer was mentally ill when he committed his crimes.
I felt that Dahmer was a perfect classic case of a serial killer. He was white, he was male, he was unmarried. Even though he can conform to law and convention on a routine basis, once he starts sinking into his fantasies and allows himself to do that, He reaches a point where he is now prowling, looking for a victim. The minute that young man was in the apartment and the door was closed, Dahmer lost it. At this point, he was driven, emotionally driven towards his end, and that would be sex with this unconscious and eventually dead individual. Dismemberment, cannibalization, all of these things would take hold. Dahmer was no longer able to step away from that.
But none of this made any difference to the families of the victims.
Jeffrey, I hate you! This is out of control! Don't with me, Jeffrey, I'll kill you! Look at me, what's your name, man?
The case of Jeffrey Dahmer was special. He invited me into his mind, and suddenly the unexplainable became explainable.
The Bob Resslers of this world, if they're not careful, can very much slip into a very bad state of mind. What they are trying to do as a good can really turn into an evil as far as they're concerned, because it could have the effect of changing their very spirit, their very essence. And it's a very fine line to walk.
The home of Lionel and Sherry Dahmer. Robert Ressler is still in touch with the father and stepmother of Jeffrey Dahmer.
I've raised 3 kids myself. It must be terrible to realize that you've raised a monster.
Like the Dahmers, Robert Ressler is still trying to find an answer to the question that is Jeffrey.
He had a small circle of friends. He participated in all kinds of activities through our urging: soccer, archery, Boy Scouts. We raised lambs together. But shyness, social ineptness, that was it. There were no signs that were made known to us. The roving around the neighborhood on his bike at about age 13 or 14, looking for dead foxes, groundhogs, whatever, was unknown to us.
I always saw Jeff, the lost child, the little boy. I saw the young, lost child.
When we sat down to talk, I was surprised to see how quick Jeff Dahmer opened up. I asked him his feelings when all this was happening, and you know, was he really enamored and into this sort of thing? He said no. He said it was like he was operating in a mechanical fashion, and it was as if he was looking down at himself and watching this occur. This is a clear indication of dissociation. Dissociation carried out to its end would be multiple personality disorder. It was like there were 2 Jeffs. One was into the horror of it all, and the other was standing back and watching. He said a lead blanket would settle over me, and I'd get this very horrible feeling of loss. His last victim told me that when he left, Jeffrey was in the bedroom, he was rocking, and he was chanting, and it seemed to be in some sort of a stupor state. When this young man came back several hours later with the police, Jeffrey hadn't budged. He was doing the same thing. Dahmer changed the way I looked at my entire approach to profiling. For the first time, I'd seen an organized killer who lost control in a psychotic episode. It taught me that not everything is black and white.
He had no knowledge at all why he was obsessed with these thoughts and these actions that he did. He had absolutely no clue as to why he did these things.
It gives you a broader understanding of the human beings that we rub shoulders with every day of our lives and who we truly don't know. We don't know their dark side.
Pain and confusion. The victims, their families, they know it well. And even the profiler is not immune to it.
Jeffrey Dahmer made me see the world with different eyes. A predator can be our own flesh and blood.
Alexandria, once again. The killer drove a knife into the chest of his victim 25 times. Finally, police arrest the Alexandria murderer.
They caught Monty Ressler in Alexandria. I was ecstatic. At a point like this, it was very much personal gratification.
Ressler had noted that the perpetrator would be a young man, late teens, early 20s. Monty Ressler was 17. Ressler had predicted that the killer would have grown up without a father. Monty Ressler's father left when the boy was 7 years old.
Once the guy was in custody, I was a little surprised only about the age. The age factor here, I thought that he would have been older. This is closure in a sense, working on something to the point where now you're going to put it away. But more importantly, I think, is the fact that you're now able to sit down with this individual to ask him questions. In a sense, it becomes validation of the profile that you've done. Were you right? Were you on the money?
Maximum security prison, Dillwyn, Virginia. This is where Monty Ressler will spend the rest of his life.
You know, you always wonder what it's like to see a man that you already know so much about. What does a monster look like? It's always surprising.
Once again, Robert Ressler is about to enter the mind of a monster. Face to face with a serial killer. Robert Ressler steps into the strange and twisted world of Monty Ressler.
What was it like to take the lives of these women?
She got out the car and started to run. And I got out and ran after her. And she ran over into this driveway where some woods were and everything. And I stabbed her in the back, and she fell on the ground. I think I stabbed her 4 or 5 more times.
All that Robert Ressler can do now is listen.
It got worse with each one. I mean, not only in terms of violence.
You get more authoritarian now?
More.
You're not negotiating anymore.
No, more. It's more demanding, more power involved. Just total control, domination. But I had such power and control over another human being. I mean, and that made me feel invincible.
Now, you weren't there waiting for somebody, were you?
No. It was just a spur of the moment. I was out walking, and I had all this stuff on my mind, and it just seemed like something snapped in me. I mean, she was just unfortunate that I was there and she came home, you know.
The work of a profiler ends here, inside the mind of a killer.
It's magic with him. He's got a key, or he's got a window that he can look through, and when he looks into it, he can see the person that's doing it.
The key to catching a serial killer is to put yourself into the thinking patterns of that individual. You have to think like him, you have to feel like him, you have to follow him into his crimes and eventually get ahead of him.
When I paint a picture for him, or I tell him what happened, he's right there. He can see and visualize what I tell him. And in so doing, he gets into my head, and he can see where I'm going, or what I'm about to do, or what I might do next.
And so the serial killer completes the profile of the profiler. Nothing is more difficult than hunting the hunter of man.
A serial killer is a predator, but they hunt human prey.
The FBI investigates at least 50 serial killings per year.
They have fantasies that drive them to violence, and they kill and kill again.
Who becomes a victim is determined by only one thing: the mind of the serial killer.
A profile is a psychological portrait of a killer. It establishes a map into the mind of the murderer.
And that is where the hunt has to begin. Alexandria, Virginia, on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., two police officers revisit a series of brutal murders that occurred 2 decades ago.
The first case that occurred, the body was found in a drain area.
Detective Tom Moorhead fills in the case history for his visitor.
The second one was reported missing, and it was 6 weeks before we found her. Her automobile was found right away.
The body count kept rising.
Number 3 was found in a creek, submerged in the water. There's a sexual assault on all those. There's, after the autopsy, fluids were sent to the lab, and it indicated that they had been raped.
The details of the killings were so gruesome they shocked even seasoned investigators.
There was 2 that was stabbed. The one had been missing for about 6 weeks. She had been stabbed somewhere at 20 times to the upper part of her body. The medical examiner had said that as an indication of overkill, which is a lot of times they're acting in sort of a frenzy.
5 women. 3 of them died in just 1 month.
At that particular point, we had no idea who it was. So we were just wondering how long would it be for the next one.
What makes a man kill his fellow man? There are no easy answers, but Robert Ressler has made it his mission to find them. The emerging profile of a profiler. Robert Ressler began his career as a military investigator for the U.S. Army. He was stationed in Europe and the Far East. In the Army, he learned how to catch criminals.
I became convinced that understanding the motives of the killer would ultimately make me better at catching them. So I started studying psychology and continued as a criminal investigator.
Upon leaving the Army, Robert Ressler was looking for a way to achieve his goal.
I wanted to work for the best, and that was the FBI. Here I thought I could combine my knowledge of criminal behavior and psychology. I was especially interested in serial killers because here I thought psychology played a major role in why they killed and how.
When Ressler joined the Bureau in 1970, his interest in modern psychology was frowned upon. The FBI was a place where hard evidence counted. Despite the internal opposition, Ressler formulated a plan to study the behavior of serial killers. He called it profiling.
And I had a working lunch with the director of the FBI this time, William Webster, at the end of the lunch, he looked at me and said, Mr. Ressler, I think you have a great idea. I want you to align yourself with academics and outside people outside the FBI of the highest quality, and I want this program to be successful. And that gave it life.
Back in Alexandria, Virginia, the killer had stabbed his victim first in the back, then the front, then everywhere. The morgue. This is where Robert Ressler looks for clues.
Each time I walk into a room like that, I'm afraid I'm going to see something worse than I've ever seen before. I figured out very early that there are two types of serial killers, and that's organized and disorganized. Just by looking at the crime scene and how the bodies are found, I can establish a pretty good basis for a profile.
Detective Moorhead tells Ressler that all victims were found completely dressed, yet they had all been raped before they were killed.
If they're dressed properly, I would say that the killer has ordered them to dress themselves. If they're dressed improperly, then it would indicate the killer dressed them after death. So whether or not they were dressed by themselves or whether or not they're dressed by the killer becomes, again, another look into the killer's mind.
Ressler notes this telling detail. If the killer was able to instruct the women to dress, this would suggest somebody who was in control of his own senses, enough to plan the kill. An organized mind at work. This is how it always begins. Picking up the scent, beginning to track the serial killer.
On a very personal level, I just wonder, what is this force that takes a hold of a person and pushes them over the edge?
Robert Ressler has been on the trail of this evil ever since he was 9 years old. Catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself. Scrawled with lipstick on the wall by a desperate killer. Chicago, 1946, a city gripped by fear. The chilling words of America's first modern serial killer captured the imagination of the entire country. 2 women, brutally murdered, found in carefully arranged settings. The killer had even bandaged the mortal wounds, as if ashamed of what he had done.
It came into my head that I must have done something, and I realized it must have been a child.
The northwest side of Chicago. This is where Robert Ressler grew up.
So it's good to be back in Chicago.
Well, you know, it's been...
He still stays in touch with his old friend Philip Kozlovsky. Together, they roamed the neighborhood streets when they were boys. It was a long, hot summer when the string of bizarre killings known as the Lipstick Murders shook the city. The boys were so intrigued, they formed their very own detective agency. Their mission? To catch the lipstick murderer.
The whole idea came from some movie that we had seen where kids were detectives, and we decided we were going to do this.
Could have been, right. Because there was a lot of cloak and dagger involved with this, you know, the kind of the false beards and the dark glasses, which, of course, no proper spy operation can be without.
But the games soon ended when the killer struck again. Police found body parts floating in the Chicago sewers. They identified the victim as 6-year-old Susan Degnan. She had been snatched from her home, murdered, and dismembered.
It really paralyzed the city of Chicago. It was a frightening aspect to have a child taken from her bedroom in the dead of night, body parts found in sewers. And of course, this guy confessing to all.
The police arrest William Herons, a 17-year-old student. He confesses everything. The lipstick murderer now has a face.
The Herons case had a tremendous impact in general on people in Chicago. And in your case, it actually led you to try to somehow gain some insight into the mind of this person as to why he was doing it. And then this led you into the career that you eventually decided upon.
That's the way I see it. The lipstick murders just caught my imagination, and that never went away. I wanted to understand people like William Herons.
Herons broke into the apartments of young women. When he was caught, he would kill, almost like an afterthought. Killing was not the satisfaction. It was a necessary evil.
The fact is he had this real obsessive-compulsive drive to do these burglaries, and it became so strong that he could no longer fight those urges. The question was, do these killers suffer from an irresistible compulsion, or is it a compulsion that they choose not to resist?
The young boy Ressler was hooked.
I made up my mind. I wanted to become a real, live detective. Remember that guy that used to deliver groceries to my house?
Mm-hmm.
The man who delivered groceries to the Ressler home was none other than one of the most horrific serial killers of our time. John Wayne Gacy, the killer in the clown mask.
Clowns get away with murder.
1978. John Wayne Gacy was a respected citizen of Chicago. On weekends, he often entertained children in a homemade clown costume. Nobody knew what the mask was really hiding.
Gacy and I grew up in the same neighborhood. We were in the Boy Scouts together. I sometimes wonder how we ended up on the opposite sides of the law. What made me a cop? What made him a serial killer?
Joe Kosensak was the man who hunted down John Wayne Gacy. Following weeks of surveillance, the chief of detectives ordered Gacy's house searched. After a young man disappeared who had spoken with Gacy about a job at his construction company, Kosensak obtained a warrant to search Gacy's house.
The crawl space was actually found by a detective who spotted a cut in the tile. And he called me over. We had a screwdriver and we pried up on the trap door. We didn't know it was a trap door at the time, but the whole bottom floor of this closet lifted up, and then we saw that this was an entry area into a crawl space. And when we opened the trap door, evidence technician dropped down into the crawl space area, and within 5 minutes called up and said that we have 3 bodies down here. And it just sent a chill up all of our backs to think that there were X unknown amounts of bodies. It's pretty overwhelming.
I heard the news on the radio. This was a huge case. There's a guy that had planned to kill 33 men and premeditated. Exactly what I was looking for to test my theories of organized serial killing.
Ressler flew to Chicago and offered to assist Joe Kosensak in his investigation.
I came in on the investigation after the body started to be found. I went to the FBI locally and said, what can I do to help?